So fluids are out in Cinema 4D 2025.3, and I've been having a little bit of a play over the last few days, and today we're going to be doing some simulations with them. And as you can see with the sim that's on screen, we're going to be doing these very kind of basic tank simulations, just a little bit of an introduction to fluid. It's actually quite similar to tutorials I've done in the past with X-Particles, but the fact that this is all possible just in Cinema 4D now is pretty cool, so we're just going to do a very similar setup, but of course with Cinema 4D particles. And I've been trying a couple of different angles, and what I'm going to do is make a couple of tutorials over my Patreon where we really try and push this in different directions. I did this render a few weeks ago of these rocks in a glass using X-Particles, and now that technically would be possible without X-Particles, so I might even just do that tutorial, because I was going to make that tutorial, and I might just do it just with some 4D particles instead. But nonetheless, what I do want to say before we jump in, if you want to get access to all those tutorials on Patreon, you can join the Discord, you'll get a discount code, and you'll be able to see all the tutorials that are there as well. Also, there's going to be a link in the description. First 5 people that hit it, you'll get my Patreon for free for 30 days. Enough said, let's make some particles. So there's 2 ways we can get liquid working in particles, and I can't wait to experiment with this more and find out new angles, more complicated ways to do things with it. The first way is the liquid fill emitter, but there's also a modifier called liquify. Now this liquid fill emitter actually comes with that modify. There was all those modify properties inside the emitter. So any particles these emit are all going to already behave like liquid. And this is what we're going to be using today. And for simulations like what we're doing, this is definitely the nice way to go, because this emitter comes with 2 patterns where we can emit, and that's sphere packing and grid. Today we're going to be using grid, and this is perfect because with fluids, when you spawn in all these particles at once, those particles are going to try and interact with each other. So on normal emitters, and you've got all these particles coming out, you have to be quite careful that those particles don't bash into each other. It's going to make things slow, it can make them explode, it can make them start to do funky stuff. So this emitter is going to be quite a bit calmer. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop in a cube here. But the first thing I'm going to do in that cube is right click it, we're going to go to render tags, display, we're going to hit use, we're going to change it to lines. And this is because what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 cubes. One we're going to use to spawn the particles, the other is going to be the container for the particles. And if you put them on this display mode, this is just going to make your life a hell of a lot easier. So if we come to our top view here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make something kind of in like 16:9 aspect ratio, right? So I'm going to make this pretty big cube. If we have a look at this here, we'll have a look at our parameters. We're at 500, and then we're at 293, so we can run that up to 300. And then on a size here that's 50, we'll bring that back down to 50, but this could be subject to change. The size here is going to have a bit of an influence on the amount of particles that we're spawning, as well as a couple of other properties that I'll show you in a second. Now what we're going to do, we can put this in here, and we can put this in a group, and we can call it utilities, and this is my X-Particles workflow coming through a little bit, but I just find this a little bit more useful, because then what we can do is we can call this cube spawn, we can duplicate that, and we can call this one container. And then in this container one, the first thing we're going to do, let's bring up that size on the Y to like 250, and then on the X let's maybe do 550, and on the Z let's maybe do 350. So this is in our F3 view, this is on the right. If we have a look at this now, we've got this big container, and we're going to be spawning the particles in here. I don't want it to be sat in the middle, because when we spawn this in, we need all the particles to drop down using gravity and then collide. I want it sitting not super far up there, but also not too close. I was seeing some bugs, whereas if you attempted to spawn it in too close, a lot of the particles were just falling through, and that could have been substep issues. And I've been trying to get through this quite quickly to get a video out, so I've not seen everything, every solution and every problem yet, but I was noticing a lot of them slipping through. So what I've been doing so far is just keeping it a little bit further above. I'm going to tighten that in a little bit, just on the Z there. If we come back to this main view, let's go to the liquid fill emitter, let's drop in the spawn. I'm going to change the amount of frames in the scene to 333. That's just going to give us some breathing room. Next up, if we do Control D and you go to simulation, or sorry, scene, you're going to see the gravity's there. And I'm going to turn that gravity off, because what I'm going to do is go to simulate, forces, gravity. I'm going to add my own gravity. And now what happens is if we hit play, we're going to spawn in a certain amount of particles, and they're going to drop down. But we need these cubes to collide. So what we need is simulate modifiers, we need a collide. And we're going going to put that in there. And then we're going to right click on the container, simulation tags, collider, and we're going to put that on the, no, we don't want that on the spawn actually, of course. We just want it on the container. I'm going to take off the friction. I'm going to change the collision side to both, and I'll leave the bounciness, yeah, around about 0.2, 0.3. That's going to have quite an influence on how much the particles kind of bounce up and down, is this bounciness here. So that's definitely something to think about. And you also have liquid collisions here. So by default it's on volume, which is good. We want that on volume. You could also change the collision side to both. That actually might be quite important. That might be what you have to do. But that's probably it for the collision settings. So if we hit play now, we're going to spawn in those particles. They're going to drop down. They're going to collide. And we have these liquids. So to make this a little bit more clear, I'm going to turn off my work plane. I'm going to turn off my world axis. And you can see we've got these liquids set there. And we already have a fairly decent amount of density, which is nice, because that's a problem that we could potentially run into with simulations like this, is you don't want this too papery thin, because then what you'll see is a bunch of particles swimming around like the floor of the cube, and it looks pretty ugly. So we want a decent amount of thickness there, and that's going to make things, help things look quite pretty. If we go to the particle group, we go to draw, turn on draw radius, crank that down to the lowest it can go, which is 0.001. This is what I've been using to visualize the particles. I quite like this. But it's not going to be easy to see what the particles are doing if they're all one color like this, especially when they're a big tank. So the next thing is simulate, modifiers, color mapper. I'm going to drop that color mapper in. I'm going to change this to velocity. And then from velocity, I'm going to change this to magnitude. And if I delete out that knot, and then let's change this first one to white. And on the upper value, let's maybe set this to 250. We're not going to see much if I just hit play right now, because we've set this to the velocity. So what we need to do is give the particles some velocity. So the way we're going to do that is with a turbulence. So if we put that turbulence in there, let's set the scale to 100 and the strength to 50. Now the reason I'm setting the scale that high is because I want this to be quite wavy. I want the particles to move about. I want them to slosh about in quite an aggressive way. I don't want too many kind of short circuits of movement. I want more kind of big waving movements. So you hit play now, you're going to see that drop, and you're going to see all these big waves. And this is kind of a nice little look at what we're going for here. But there's a couple of problems, and this is where we're going to move to the emitter now. We're going to go to the properties, and we have all of these liquid properties here. Now, a lot of the things in the scene that we're going to be using by default are on simulation scene, and I don't want them on simulation scene. So first of all, in the emission, under the resolution, I'm going to change that to override. And in the properties on the source, with the radius, I'm going to change that to override as well. I'm also going to do that with the damping. Now, when you look at these particles right now, what you're seeing is a lot of cohesion, a lot of tension. These particles, well, a lot of viscosity as well. These particles are very thick. This liquid is very thick. This is kind of like, it's not quite as viscous as honey. It's maybe a little bit more like milk. I want this to be really light. I want this to be super sloshy. I don't want really any viscosity there. So the first thing I'm going to do is drop that viscosity to 0.01. I don't want that all the way in 0, but 0.01. And now when we hit play, what you're immediately going to see already, you're going to see way more particles that are kind of detaching in singularity and kind of splashing away from each other. And that's much more the movement that I want. Things are a bit more aggressive now. Things feel a bit more detached. That's definitely more of the movement that I want. There's a couple of other things here that are going to affect that. The friction, I've been messing with the friction values. With this, we can maybe go somewhere near about 15. Target density, that is also going to have a lot of an effect on, of course, as you imagined, the density, and that is going to impact how the particles behave to an extent, especially more so particles interacting with each other. So what you can imagine is if this density was really high, the liquids might not mix with each other, whereas if it's on a low density, they would mix with each other. So let's drop that, for example, down to 500. And then on the surface tension, let's also drop that to 0.01. We don't want much surface tension there. We want the tension to break. And the reason we want these kind of effects is because, of course, I'm not measuring these particles. I want these cool interactions between all the particles. I'm probably going to make them rocks as well, which is what I did on my XP tutorial years ago. And the fun thing about using rocks as well is it means you don't have to go for a really, really high particle count. We can keep the particles quite big, which means using a lower count, and then the rocks are going to be quite identifiable. So this is quite a nice introduction to liquids, I feel, because it doesn't require too much pushing. But spending time here in this kind of zone is really where we can nail things in. And already we're getting something quite decent. But another issue we have right now is that density that I mentioned, more the thickness, is this is getting very, very thin. There's two ways we control the amount of particles in this scene. One of them is in the emission, underneath the distance. We lower that distance, that's going to increase the amount of particles. But in tandem to that, we have to lower the radius. And I'm going to show you here is if I keep this radius on 3, and I drop this distance down from 6 to 3, what you're most likely going to see is all the particles exploding out, and that's because the distance is too small against the radius, so they don't know what to do and they just explode. So as we're changing these values, you can get away with them kind of puffing out a little bit because usually they will calm down again if it's not too bad. We need to find a balance between a slightly higher count with the particle size being accurate so they don't explode out. So by default, I believe that was on 3. Distance, let's just set this to 4, and let's set the radius to 2. That might be enough, and it is. You can see they've stayed in the box, and they're dropping down. And we've got a nice sim there. But we're still kind of suffering from the thickness there. And it's not too bad, it's looking a bit better, but I think I want them sitting a little bit higher. One way I was countering that is if we come back to the beginning frame, was making this box, the spawn box, a little bit bigger. Because our radius is set and our distance is set, we can technically just increase the height of this box to increase the amount of particles we're going to have without worrying about those other properties now. So that might be enough. Of course, it's going to slow the scene down a little bit. It might be enough to give me the thickness that I want. And I'd say that it's pretty much nearly there. Coming back to this though, the radius, what if we set that radius to 2.5? Will it explode? It's just on the verge of exploding, but it's not quite. And you can see just from that there is lots more thickness. But I don't think I want the particles that big. So if we keep the radius in 2, what if we made the distance 3.5? And I think using kind of interval numbers there is going to be quite important, and that's kept its distance. It hasn't exploded out. Looks quite nice. And we've certainly got a fair amount more thickness just off that little change. What I think I will do though is under that turbulence, I think I will drop in another turbulence, and I'll set this to 50%, and I'll keep this, I'll put the strength to 60%, but on this first turbulence I'm actually going to drop the strength down to 25, I'm going to drop the frequency down to about 80, and we can call this one big, we can call this one small. And this is hopefully going to give us some slightly more kind of micro movements, because right now, although we have these big waves moving about, some of them are a little bit too big, and that small turbulence might also help kind of get that aggressive fluid that I want. And I think I saw in the Max on live stream as well as these particles are PBD based, so those are generally the fastest kind of fluids that we can use, and they definitely feel quite fast. And typically when I've done these tutorials in the past in X particles or whatnot, I have used, especially to do big tanks like this, I've used flip fluids. But PBDs definitely do get the job done, either way. And this is quite good, but what I think I might actually do, and it's important to kind of know what things you need to change to get the effects you want. I think I'm actually going to make the container a bit bigger on all sizes. And that's going to help with the density a little bit. And sometimes changing those things, I don't want to make it too big, because then, you know, we might immediately be struggling with the density again. But just because there's such a high amount, I just think it might look a little bit nicer, giving them a bit more breathing room. They're maybe bouncing up a little bit too high. So if we come to our properties here, I mean, even the collider tag, have a look at that. We can bring the bounciness down. Like I said, that is going to affect things. The friction, we could maybe bring that up to 30. We could maybe crank up the damping a couple of %, maybe even just 1. The viscosity, surface tension, maybe that can come up to 0.05. Interaction mass, maybe that can come up to 1. Now, of course, on that first drop, once we cache the simulation, we are going to cut that out, which is why you want more frames here than you probably are going to use in your final animation, is because the sort of first 30 frames or so, we're going to cut completely out while it drops in. We don't really want to see any of that. If we just play through this a little second and see what kind of movement goes on once everything settles down, and see if we can see anything nice going on. And I think for the most part I'm pretty happy with this. I could keep tweaking with values, but for the most part It looks quite nice. I'm actually just going to turn off the container and the spawn in the viewport, just so we can see this tank in its entirety. In the color mapper, I'm going to increase that upper even more. Just going to drag that up, and that's going to lighten the color there a little bit. Maybe bring it back down a bit, just so we don't have as many big dark blue areas. This is nice, but it is very aggressive. This is very aggressive. So looking at the turbulences, we can maybe drop the strength of both of them. Come back to the beginning. And let's even actually bring the small one down a bit more and the bigger one up. Nearly 100 frames into the simulation. And I quite like what's going on, but we're kind of back to suffering from some of these thin parts now. Let's bring the target density back up to 750. So maybe what we could do instead is come back to the container and just sort of pull that in a little bit again and see if that helps. And because I'm making these rocks as well as these particles that are really not super cohesive and are really splashing about, that's absolutely going to look awesome, and that's definitely what I want. So I think just bringing in that container and upping that density a little bit has done a solid amount of work there. We are still seeing a little bit of the bottom, but this might be enough that we can get away with. But overall, the movement that I'm seeing now, I like a lot. We're maybe dealing with them pushing up at the sides a little bit too much, and most of that is going to come from this big turbulence here. So if we were to have a look at the simulation without that big turbulence, and also the amount that they're dropping, they could be dropping a little bit too much. We may even want to lower that, because of course they're just going to be grabbing way more speed and way more velocity from the amount that they have to drop at the beginning. So that big splash up at the sides can last a long time throughout the simulation if they have a lot to drop at the beginning. So you can see by lowering that and turning off the big turbulence, that's actually gave us some of that density back. And we can bring back on the big turbulence as well in a second. But that's probably a little bit more what I'm after. The main reason I don't want to go forward with that all the way to render is when you actually look at that in the render, you know, it's a bit bumpy, and looking at lights and kind of, it'll look good in motion, but at least in stills, I think we want a little bit more aggression in the actual surface. And this isn't a terrible amount, but that big turbulence, of course, is going to help with that quite a lot. Because you just by turning that on there, you're immediately seeing more movement, more height, which is where a mixture of both is good. The next thing we're going to look at, and this will be our final modifier, plus a couple of little changes before we move into render, is we're going to look at getting a cool little rotation on these, which is of course going to make the simulation a little bit more art directed and make it look a little bit cooler. Before I jump into that, I'm going to save the scene because we do not want to lose the progress we have. And I will mention as well that all these project files will be available on my Patreon, so if you want to download these and check them out, you can check them out. If you're having any trouble with the simulations or just need to kind of look at my parameters and the way things are behaving close up, you can go and check them out there. Now, the way I'm actually going to put this rotation in here is not actually with a rotation. I'm going to do it with a field force. I'm going to put that field force in there, and I'm going to grab a circle. And I'm going to set this circle to XZ. I'm going to drop it down to a radius of about 100. And then I'm going to put that in the field force, but it's not doing anything by being a child of it, and that's just for kind of being tidy in the scene. I'm going to put the circle in here, and I'm going to select it, and I'm going to bump the offset up to 100%. Now, when you create field force, it creates these vectors, which is going to create velocity based off those vectors. I'm going to put the strength up to something like 500, and you can see that those vectors are following the tangent of the circle. I'm going to turn the field force off in the viewport so we don't have to look at those vectors. If I play this now, though, is every single particle on an infinite distance is going to follow this and attempt to spin. But what I want is more of just a spin in the middle of the scene. And I find this a little bit more consistent than the rotation, and using this also gives you a little bit more freedom and a little bit more art direction to set things up in various ways. And you can see, even if you did want this effect, now every particle in the scene and the tank as a whole is kind of spinning around on that axis. But the reason I don't want this is because I don't want that kind of opening up at the bottom. I don't quite like the look of that. If we drop in a cylinder field, I'm going to go to F3. I'm going to select that cylinder field. I want it sat a decent height above. And we can go to the field and increase the radius. But what we want is, we're going to increase the inner offset a little bit as well, is we just want some particles in the middle to be affected by this. And we don't want it set all the way up at the bottom, because in the particles that are kind of to the lower end of the density and closer to the surface of the tank will not get affected by the cylinder field, which means they won't get affected by the rotation. Now this may take a little bit of moving to make sure it hits the right spot, but what this should give us is just a nice sort of rotation in the middle, and then everything outside of that will just be affected by the turbulences. If I come to my F2 view here to watch this, you should see a decent amount of this going on. I think I can see it. Sometimes it takes a little bit into the animation to see. I may just drop it down a little bit. And you could increase the strength drastically as well. But I think that's probably enough. That's definitely having an effect. You could increase the strength as well, of course, but we brought that up to 1500. I think around about 500 is what I used on my initial render. That seems like a nice amount. But if I play my render on screen right now you know that that is a modifier in the scene. You will be able to pinpoint it and notice that slight rotation in the middle. It's a little bit hard to see in the viewport, but I can assure you it's there. The last thing we need to do before we move on to rendering, like I said, I really wanted this to be simple. I really wanted to just introduce you to fluids, especially if you've not used X particles before, and this is your first time really messing about with liquid simulations. Doing simulations like this is really, really good, because a lot of people can feel like you need to always mesh liquid sims and you need to always make it look like actual liquid. And my fun with liquid simulations is 100% just keeping them as particles, but the benefit of liquid sims is, of course, particles interact with each other. Particles collide off one another. That's really like a good portion of the extent of it, and that just opens up so much ability to art direct compared to not having collisions. And of course there's other properties in there: cohesiveness, friction, tension, all these other things that create that liquid simulation effect. But I really wanted this to be quite simple and easy to follow and fun, and also a little bit different. But there's one last thing that I need to teach you about particles. And if you come to the emitter and you go to properties and you scroll down, you're going to see this thing here called velocity. You're going to see this velocity tab. If you were going to render these particles as spheres, this isn't so important, but I'm going to make them rocks. Now, generally in a lot of particle simulations, particles don't come with rotational data. Now, you can't tell this in the viewport, and if you're rendering them with spheres, you certainly won't be able to know this. If you've watched any of my Cinema 4D particle tutorials I did towards the end of last year, you would have saw that I generally like to render them with cubes. This is because it makes them look a little bit cooler. You've got different sides for light to bounce off of. And today I'm going to be using rocks. And as you can imagine, like I'm explaining, these particles do not have rotational data. We need to add this. I don't seem to have much luck with the spin modifiers. There is modifiers here under simulate, modifiers, spin. These are supposed to give rotational data to the particles, and I can't seem to get them working. I've tried it in the past, it doesn't really work. Under a normal emitter, if I just drop in an emitter as an example, in a basic emitter, we have emission here. Where are we? Angular velocity. That adds, if we set this to random or velocity direction, we give it some speed, that's going to rotate the particles. For some reason, this liquid fill emitter doesn't have that. It's just got this big velocity tab here. Now, what I was doing to get rotation in the particles, and this took me a little bit of playing to figure out, is I was setting this to custom. We set the vectors to 0, and I was setting the speed to about 5. You don't want much speed at all here. Otherwise, your particles are just going to be spinning really, really aggressively, and it's going to look quite strange in the animation, especially if you slow it down, because the particles could be spinning so fast that then you could put the simulation in slow-mo, but the particles are still spinning really fast. So a speed of about 5 is usually fine, but this is what I did. I set it to custom 0, 0, 0, and that gives us some rotational data. Now what we can do is cache the simulation, and we can do a little render with it. And I'm going to drop in some rocks. I'll also show you some alternatives, because I believe my rocks were from Polygon, but I'll show you some alternatives that you can use as well. And we'll do a nice little render with this, and we'll be on our way. So I'm going to save this again. We can go to the particle group. We can just go to cache object, and we're still caching to Alembic, but usually this is quite fast. Just going over, if we do Control D again, going over our simulation settings, particles, you could increase your substeps. I don't feel like it's really needed. We are losing some particles at the bottom of the tank, but not enough to really be worried about. Simulation, liquids, I think everything is kind of fine here. I'm quite happy with the way things look, especially just as a basic introduction to particles. So we come back to the particle group. We're going to cache this now. Okay, so we've got the simulation completely cached. You can see how fast that is. And that is really lovely fluid. I think we've actually done quite a good job there. You know, you've got this kind of surface tension, and then occasionally you've just got a bit like that where it just splashes them everywhere. This is really what we're after. This looks cool. And this project file from the tutorial will be on the Patreon if you're after it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to get rendering this. So the first thing I think I'm going to do, I'm actually, right at the end, I'm going to mess with the timing here, because the second you retime this, the alembic gets much slower in the viewport. It wouldn't be so slow if we were to actually just crank this back here on the offset. That doesn't really seem to slow things down. So that's always a way around things. But we're going to lose 50 frames there, so that would be 283, I believe it'll stop. Whereas what you can actually do when you time remap it is you can just lift up the beginning here, and then it'll still end at your max frame point, and actually slow everything down a little bit as well. And I'll just drop the frame length down to like 250, so we're only losing 30 frames or so, but that way it doesn't cut out. Now I've got these two rock boulder models. I got them from Polygon, I believe, but if we have a look at GSG Plus, I've used these in particle sims before, and they actually are really, really, really good. You could of course use little rock packs from Megascans, then load them off Fab, God forbid, or something. You can usually get like these little stone packs, which is the kind of ones that I'm using today. The ones that I'm using, I believe, are from Polygon though. But if you come and have a look at the models on GSG Studio, they have these geometric stone models, and they actually look great for simulations like this. I've used this in a few, and you would maybe want to collect about 5, get a little bit of variation in there, but they look really, really good. And if we play through the simulation here, let's go to like frame, I like that bit where it's splashed over, but there's a lot of those bits. We'll just go to like frame 70. We'll get Redshift booted up and on the go, and we will hit render. Now I'm going to up the resolution here to 2560 by 1440. Of course, we don't want the containers on in render, so we're going to turn on those little dots and make them red. Next up, cameras, standard. I'm going to set the focal length to 250. 0 the X, 0 the Z, 0 the H. And we'll do -90, so we're looking down at the particles, and we can just zoom out here till it fills the frame. And then we're going to want to right click on the particle group. We're going to go render tags, artist object. We're going to change this to custom objects. And I'm going to drop in my 2 objects. And we're going to need some lighting because that doesn't look very nice. So what you can do is just drop in an area light. Now I'm going to press F2. Cameras, perspective. Now what I'm doing is changing that top view to another viewport, so I can move about and light the scene without it affecting what I'm seeing here. So if I put a target on the light, let's target the particle group. I'm going to put this light above it. I'm going to make it a bit thinner. What we really want to think about when we're lighting these is we don't want the light too high up because it's not going to cause shadows. So we want it nearly sitting in line with the particles, but we want it a little bit higher because we want more light than what we're seeing there. But something around about here is probably good. And you can see just off that, you have a very, very nice looking render. I'm actually, I'm quite happy with this one. Looks cool. What we can do though is also go to Redshift. We can go to lights, add in a dome light. We're going to turn it off in the camera, but this will be our shadows. So I don't want the shadows all the way dark like they are here, but we can just set this a little bit lighter, something like that. And then I'm going to drop in a LUT. These LUTs are available on my Patreon. They're not from me, but they were free and posted publicly in a forum. But if you join the Discord or join the Patreon, you'll see all these LUTs. So we can drop that in. I'm going to apply color management before LUT. I'm going to drop it down to nearly 0.5, 0.6-ish. I'm going to turn on color controls. I'm going to give that an ever so slight bump in the shadows and a bump in the highlights. And then if we come to the Redshift camera, color collection, tone mapping, I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to bring this down a little bit. And the saturation and blacks and stuff, we can leave that for now. Because what we're going to do is we're going to make a material. We're going to drop that on both of these rocks. And I'm going to open up that material. We're going to drop in a user color data, color user data. I always get that the wrong way around. If we drop this in the color and we go to presets, particles, particle color, and you're going to have to refresh the IPR there to get that to work. We now have the colors in there. Now, of course, you're not limited to these colors. We can put in a ramp and we can change the colors as we want. So let's say I wanted to do an orange and a white. We can do an orange and a white, and you would want to play with the knots and the distance of these knots. That's more of a yellow, but there we go. Although I do like the blue. The blue looks really cool. But similar to the reference, if we were to do a darker orange, maybe mixed with a slight yellow, it's really kind of natural stone colors. I'm going to increase the roughness a little bit. We'll come back to the camera now. We can crank up that saturation. We can go to the optical. We can add some vignetting, maybe a little bit more. And we can go back to color correction. We can increase the blacks. We can increase the blacks threshold. Get a bit of contrast in there. And you can see just off that, you have a nice render. What would you do to mess with this or make it better? You could add a light at the bottom. I would light this really uniformly. Light at the sides, top at the bottom. Change the colors. There's one little thing that I want to do on the render though. And I'm going to save this and then save it again. Just make a couple of variations, thinking forward to you guys having the project files. I'm going to duplicate these rocks. And I'm going to duplicate them again, and again, and again, and again. And then what we're going to do now instead is grab all of these and put them in here. And the reason I've made so many is because I want to have some rocks bigger, some rocks smaller. So what we need is a higher amount of variation in the particle objects to then make sure that it doesn't make too many of them too big or too many of them too small. So if I come back to F2 here, and we can see we've got the rocks all the way off there in the distance. If I press S, that takes me to the rock. And I were to make this 170%, well, 70% bigger than it was. And we scale up some of these. You can see, of course, they're absorbing quite a bit more light now, so let's blew out the render a little bit. But let's even just go to, for example, the bottom one. Let's make that significantly smaller. So what I'm trying to do here is get some variation. I'm trying to get some bigger rocks and some smaller rocks. And you usually just want to keep messing with them until you see. Now you can see that there's just two. When I scale up, that looks cool. Immediately makes it look better. But there's too many of them. I don't want that many big ones. If we change the distribution to random, that might help with that. But we are dealing with a pretty significant amount of particles. So you might just want to take like the last, this amount and duplicate them again. And what that's going to effectively do is decrease the amount of those big ones that are in there. But that adds a certain amount of detail and a certain amount of resolution to the simulation that wasn't there before, which looks nice. The only issue is now they are bigger, they're absorbing more light, so we may want to decrease. You can see we've got some blowouts. Pressing F1 helps with that a lot, because when the camera isn't selected here to the camera that we actually want, when you press F2, it disables a lot of the camera. So those blowouts weren't actually as bad as I thought they were. Maybe just bring the saturation back a little bit. But I want to say that's pretty much the render done. I'm very happy with this. I think for the tutorial we've done a great job. I hope that has gave you a very nice little introduction to cool fluid simulations you can do now in Cinema 4D and Redshift. All you need is a Cinema 4D license and you can do this. That's crazy. If you said that to me 10 years ago, I would have not believed you. This is absolutely awesome that we can do this now, and I'm going to do more of these over on Patreon. I'm going to see how far we can really push it and really go absolutely crazy with it. So I've got my head down over the next couple of days. I'm getting those tutorials out. I was actually making a bunch of other tutorials for Patreon, and then all of a sudden fluids were out, so I had to abandon everything I was doing to just make all of these tutorials on fluids, because I wanted to jump on it fast. Hope you enjoyed this. Project files on Patreon. All the other tools I've used here today are over there as well. Thanks for watching this. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next tutorial very soon.